Police officers in Birmingham have been attacked with fireworks, fired at point-blank range, as if the city's streets had abruptly become a testing ground for chaos. The first explosions tore through the night with a violence no one anticipated. Bursts of color followed by screams, sharp cracks ricocheting off tower blocks, and the unmistakable sense that something had shifted. And from that moment, the night did not unfold, it unraveled. What began as scattered flashes quickly hardened into a coordinated assault. Rockets were launched directly at officers, sparks hammered against shields. Police vans were forced to reverse under fire. Families watched from behind locked doors as sirens tangled with smoke. The city felt trapped in a moment it had not seen coming, unsure when it would end, and even more unsure why it had begun at all. Yet beneath the noise, a deeper question formed. Why Birmingham, and why now? It was never simply about the fireworks. It was about everything that had been simmering long before the first rocket flew.
To understand tonight's eruption, we must look beyond the immediate clashes and into the wider reality Birmingham has lived with for months. The force policing this city is exhausted. Officers have spoken openly about endless overtime, slipping response times, and equipment that is aging faster than it can be replaced. Britain's front line has been stretched so thin that even routine calls now feel like triage. Birmingham, with its sprawling estates, youthful population, and rapidly shifting demographics, sits at the center of these pressures. Rising youth crime has left officers responding to incidents at a pace they can no longer sustain. Communities dealing with the double burden of economic hardship and migration pressures have become increasingly frustrated. And all of it has accumulated quietly, forming the dry ground upon which tonight's sparks landed. When police issued a Section 60 order granting expansive stop-and-search powers, it wasn't the beginning of control. It was an acknowledgement of how fragile that control had already become. And so, even as officers pushed back against the firework volleys, the deeper story was already taking shape. Birmingham wasn't simply reacting to violence. It was revealing the conditions that had made that violence possible.
The scenes in Birmingham may feel shocking, but they are rooted in national tensions Britain has been trying to avoid confronting. Over the past year, the country witnessed some of the largest anti-immigration demonstrations in recent memory. Political rhetoric hardened, communities split over cultural, economic, and identity issues, and resentment, once scattered, began to consolidate. In Birmingham, those national pressures became personal. Rents rose sharply, food prices consumed savings, youth services already overstretched struggled to absorb growing needs. Mental health waiting lists lengthened to the point where help often arrived too late. Families found themselves juggling more stress than ever, while young people in particular slipped between the cracks. It is in this environment of uncertainty, frustration, and eroding trust that tonight's events found oxygen. Fireworks did not manufacture instability, they exposed it. Birmingham's eruption was not an anomaly, it was the visible surface of something deeper, the outward expression of pressures accumulating inside communities that feel increasingly disconnected from the institutions meant to serve them. And that truth is perhaps the most unsettling part of tonight's story. The violence was sudden, but the reasons behind it were not.
As the night unfolded, a second realization took shape, one far more consequential than the spectacle of flashing lights and burning debris. Britain's ability to respond to unrest is itself reaching a breaking point. Prisons across the country are at or near maximum capacity, leaving offenders cycling in and out of custody with alarming speed. Court backlogs have grown so vast that justice has slowed to a crawl, and officers, already stretched thin, are left questioning whether the deterrence they rely upon still holds. For criminals, hesitation becomes opportunity. When word spreads that the system is overwhelmed, that consequences may be delayed or even avoided, the boundaries that once kept order intact begin to soften. And when policing becomes reactive rather than preventative, neighborhoods sense the shift immediately. Birmingham exposed this shift in real time. The fireworks were a symptom, the response, or lack of it, was the diagnosis. Tonight's violence spiraled not because officers were absent, but because the structure supporting them could no longer absorb another shock. And that raises a question the entire country must now grapple with. If this is what one night of concentrated pressure looks like, what happens when the pressures grow larger?
In the aftermath, attention inevitably turns to Westminster. But at a time when cities like Birmingham are grappling with rising instability, the political spotlight sits elsewhere, on renegotiations with Europe, on defending migration policy, on budget disputes and party infighting. The distance between political priorities and street-level reality has rarely felt wider. Residents watching the violence unfold want clarity. Officers want reinforcement. Communities want certainty. Instead, they hear familiar phrases about monitoring the situation, statements that acknowledge unrest without addressing the conditions beneath it. It leaves a sense of hesitation at the very moment the country needs decisiveness. And this gap between what government says and what the street feels is where instability grows. Birmingham's eruption is not just a policing failure or a community strain. It is a political warning. If leadership cannot move at the pace of crisis, then the crisis will set the pace for the country.
As the smoke fades and the city returns to a brittle quiet, the true meaning of tonight becomes clearer. Britain is not collapsing, but it is straining. The forces bearing down on the country, migration pressure, economic anxiety, youth unrest, policing fatigue, overcrowded prisons, and deepening political division, are converging in ways that make pockets of instability more likely, not less. Birmingham is not an outlier. It is a preview, a reminder that the line between order and disorder is far thinner than it once was, and that the pressures shaping modern Britain are beginning to surface in unpredictable and explosive ways. So now Britain faces a question it can no longer delay. Was tonight's violence a momentary rupture, destined to fade with the morning light, or was it an early sign of a country approaching the limits of what its institutions can contain? Because what happened in Birmingham was more than chaos. It was a message, and whether the nation listens will determine what comes next.
Kemi Badenoch just dropped the one issue Keir Starmer could not defend. A brutal list of Labour's U-turns that left the Prime Minister visibly red in the face. Family farms forced into panic selling. Digital ID scrapped after public backlash. Business rates hammering pubs already on their knees. And a government that promises certainty but keeps reversing its own policies under pressure. She said it plainly. You blow around like a plastic bag in the wind. For the first time, Starmer didn't have an answer. This wasn't a debate about a single policy. It was a direct strike at the core of his leadership. A government drifting, reacting, backtracking, and a country paying the price.
And let's be clear, Mr. Speaker, this mess goes beyond pubs. The whole of the hospitality industry, cafes, hotels, restaurants, they're all being clobbered by Labour's tax hikes. I asked him if he understood the impact of his own policy. He didn't say yes. The reason he U-turns all the time is because he is clueless. He is blowing around like a plastic bag in the wind, no sense of direction whatsoever.
What happened next inside the Commons was unlike the routine Wednesday crossfire. The chamber snapped into silence when Badenoch stood, her tone sharpened with something colder than criticism. It was indictment. She walked the Prime Minister through each policy reversal like an auditor reading the final report on a failing corporation. Digital ID, introduced, defended, then suddenly abandoned. Family farms tax, announced with confidence, reversed in embarrassment. Business rates, designed to modernise revenue but blindsided its own supporters. Starmer attempted to counter with familiar lines about turning the country around, but the room wasn't buying it. The energy shifted. MPs leaned in. Even Labour backbenchers stiffened, sensing the weakness behind their front bench. When Badenoch raised the family farms tax, the reversal that forced farmers into selling land in fear, that's when it happened. Starmer flushed, his jaw tightened, and the entire chamber saw it. The Prime Minister rattled, cornered, exposed. And the silence in that moment was deafening. Some MPs later described it as the split second where the illusion of control slipped from the Prime Minister's hands. Others said it felt like watching a leader realise in real time that the narrative had turned against him. Even journalists in the press gallery exchanged glances. This was no longer a routine skirmish, but a symbolic unmasking of Labour's internal contradictions.
The clash inside Parliament didn't take place in a vacuum. Outside Westminster, the public mood has darkened. Data this week revealed a remarkable disconnect. Nearly 2/3 of British voters believe immigration is rising, even though legal migration has dropped. That perception gap reflects something deeper, a crisis of trust.
And the Home Office's new strategy to film immigration raids on TikTok only amplified that distrust. For some, it looked like transparency. For many others, it felt like the government resorting to spectacle because policy outcomes weren't materializing. At the same time, rural communities, already skeptical of Labour, watched the family farms debacle unfold with dismay. For weeks, rumours spread that inheritance changes would devastate farming estates. Panic sales followed. Then, 2 days before Christmas, Labour reversed course. It was too late for many families who had already acted on confused signals. This is why the attack resonated far beyond London. In villages, in market towns, in the agricultural belt stretching through Yorkshire, Devon, Wales and the Midlands, farmers had already been speaking in whispers about whether Labour understands rural Britain at all. Many felt mocked, marginalised or misunderstood. And Badenoch's confrontation gave voice to that anger. It turned policy confusion into political symbolism, the idea that modern Westminster elites legislate first and comprehend consequences later.
When Badenoch shifted to business rates, the chamber once again tensed. Landlords across Britain have been fighting rising energy bills, supply costs and wage pressures. The latest rate changes pushed many to the brink. And the revelation that ministers may not have understood the full consequences, it hit like petrol on smouldering resentment. Starmer responded by blaming the Conservatives for historic pub closures, a move that felt defensive rather than decisive. Because voters remember more than partisan blame. They remember the real closures in real towns, and they see the effects of new policies in real time. The Prime Minister promised support, but as Badenoch made painfully clear, reassurance now rings hollow when so many decisions appear hastily drafted and quietly reversed. And this is where the stakes become existential. The British pub is not merely a business, it is a cultural foundation. Each closure represents a fracture in community life, an extinguished social centre. When a government is perceived as accelerating that decline, even indirectly, the emotional backlash is fierce. That is why Badenoch's line landed so hard. She wasn't just attacking policy, she was portraying Labour as disconnected from the social fabric of the country. The most unexpected twist of the day came when Starmer tried turning the spotlight towards Conservative chaos. He highlighted MPs abandoning their party and drifting towards Reform UK, including former Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi. His departure marked the 23rd defection to Reform, a symbol of the political vacuum forming on the right. But Badenoch spun this to her own advantage. She reminded Parliament and the cameras that Zahawi's warning wasn't simply about the Conservatives, it was about every party losing credibility through inconsistency and indecision. Her message was unmistakable. If Labour continues like this, Reform won't just hurt the Tories, it will carve into Labour's support too. For a government elected on promises of stability, the prospect of losing ground this early in the term is chilling.
This wasn't just a heated PMQ session, it was a diagnostic test on the state of British governance, and the results were sobering. A government that keeps reversing policies, even for valid reasons, inevitably fuels suspicion. When reversals come after panic, confusion, or economic damage, the suspicion deepens. And when those reversals span multiple sectors, farming, hospitality, digital security, it transforms into a narrative of systemic drift. Starmer's greatest strength had been the image of competence. Wednesday showed cracks in that image. Badenoch's attack worked because it captured something already forming in the public consciousness, that the government reacts to pressure rather than setting direction. And in politics, perception almost always precedes reality. Once the public begins to believe a government is losing grip, every miscommunication looks like chaos, every adjustment looks like retreat, and every policy looks like improvisation. That is the danger now unfolding for Labour. It is not merely that Badenoch embarrassed Starmer, it is that she articulated a fear many voters already held but had not yet heard reflected in Parliament. Moments like this shape political narrative far more deeply than manifestos or policy briefings.
So, here's the uncomfortable truth now hovering over Westminster. If a Prime Minister begins to look uncertain, overwhelmed or reactive, if every policy becomes a headline followed by a reversal, If sectors from farming to hospitality feel blindsided, then how long before political drift becomes political collapse? Badenoch didn't just embarrass Starmer, she exposed a pattern, and patterns are much harder to erase than one bad PMQs. And so the question Britain now faces is stark, unsettling and unavoidable. Is this government still in control, or has the unravelling already begun?